They were two very interesting talks, and I hope have provoked a lot of questions. I mean, you're here with people who are working in high-profile roles in really interesting fields, so I think the best way to make the most of this is to throw questions at them for 20 minutes or so. One thing I should mention, completely unrelated, is that if somebody's ordered a vegan lunch, could they make themselves known to staff when they come and pick that up a bit later on? But over to these guys, or over to you, please, if there's anything you want to ask. Go ahead.
So you both mentioned your respective graduate schemes in the different pathways. Could you talk a little bit about how us as PhD students have maybe a different task going through that compared to the actual graduates going through the graduate scheme? Do we maybe have an advantage, or are we on the same level playing field?
So from my point of view, I honestly think you have a real advantage going into, we call it a graduate scheme, but the FAST stream isn't necessarily just for graduates. We have people of all ages applying. We do see a bit of a trend of people with PhDs being more successful at applying for the scheme, because you just have a lot more experience in terms of both the softer and the analytical skills compared to someone who's fresh out of university. That being said, I think it's something like 40% to 60% PhD students who end up on the Gauss FAST stream.
For our scheme, having a PhD is definitely an advantage when you're going through the selection process, because what happens in practice is you end up working with some group, and that group have a project to do, and you'll have stuff to do as part of that work. If you come in straight from as a graduate, an graduate, then they can do good work, but it's still a lot of training that they need. I mean, you'll probably all remember this when you first started your PhD. There's still a bit of a learning curve in how to organise yourself. If you have a PhD, a manager who's bringing that person into the group knows that they can put them to work very quickly. They'll be very efficient and much more productive. And so for that reason, they want that person in the group. So they'll pick a PhD graduate preferentially. Also, for the actual candidate themselves, that's good, because obviously they hit the ground running. They get a very good first impression with everyone they work with, relatively to the other graduate scheme candidates. And they, as I said in my talk, they tend to progress away. They progress much more quickly through the organisation into different areas. Also, they tend to be much more sure of what they want. Much more clear thinking, and so they can choose where they want to go and assess the different placements that they have. So all in all, I'd say they have a strong advantage, and it's a worthwhile thing.
Okay, great question. Okay. It's a rare opportunity to talk to these guys. There you go. Thank you.
Bruce, you said when you were working for the SDFC, you were meant to be doing astronomy, but you ended up working in a much more technical role. So you clearly had a lot of flexibility in exactly what you did. So my question is that generally true within industry, and how much flexibility you have to direct your own work?
There is flexibility. You don't. So when I remember one of the occasions when I left what is traditionally academia and went into industry, many of the people I've worked for would say things like, "Oh, you lose all your freedom to do whatever you want to do," and this is something I've heard personally quite a lot. The issue is, though, that the freedom to do what you want to do. I mean, this may not be true in all aspects. I'm working in instrumentation and instrument development, so it's true here, I think. You have the freedom to do what you think you can win the funding to do. And then you find a reason for why that funding is really worth doing. And so what you end up doing is you follow technology development, and you find new uses for it, and you try and find your own distinctive avenue and pursue that. Within working at Airbus, since I've been there, I started and I worked on a few exploration projects because I thought they were interesting. Recently, my work is going to entirely ramp down because an opportunity came up, as I mentioned in the talk, to work on Plato, which is a project which I'm particularly interested in. So I have chosen to drop all of the other projects I'm working on to focus entirely on that. And that is my choice. I could have chosen to work on the Earth Observing project. I could focus on exploration. That freedom comes from a big company. If you don't work in a big organisation, then the organisations will often specialise. So certain things like there's Deimos Space UK, GMV, various other industries, and they have their own specialities. I'd suggest that if you know what you're interested in, look for a company that does that work. If you're not so sure, try to get into a bigger company like Airbus. I only use it as an example. It shouldn't be too narrow, but look around, but keep that in mind that with big organisations you can move around. Once you've got a clearer idea, been there for a few years, you can reassess if you want to. But I think there is freedom there. There is less freedom than in academia, but I don't think it's as bad as people often say.
Thank you.
Don't remember.
Hi, I have a question for Nicky. You mentioned that the GORS has multiple offices outside of London. Can you comment briefly on what freedom there is as either a fast stream or a mainstream applicant to dictate what part of the country you get to work in?
Sure. There's actually a lot of freedom. When you apply as either a mainstreamer or a fast streamer, you can state your preference for location. And basically what that will determine is, so you'll most likely get the location of your preference, but it might restrict what departments you can go to. So for example, if you're based in Newcastle, we have DWP offices there, we also have HMRC offices and education, but not much else. In Leeds we've got DWP and health, Sheffield we've got education and formerly known as Bays, I believe it's now called. So, yeah, there's quite a lot of freedom, really. Where it might restrict you is, especially as a fast streamer, if you want to build up all those skills and all that experience by moving amongst different departments, which you don't necessarily have to do, then it could restrict you in terms of what departments you move to.
Just on the back of that previous question again for you, Bruce had mentioned that there was the opportunity for you to move around to different areas, try out new places and do different roles within the organisation, maybe to get a wider scope of the overall work Airbus would do. Could you do something similar for the Home Office, or is it a little bit more restricted? Because as you mentioned before you started, you didn't know what operational researcher really was. So if you go into it and you didn't like it, or you just wanted to get a broader knowledge of what goes on, could you try different areas and experience different jobs?
Yes. So I won't use the Home Office as an example. Well, okay, yes, I'll use the Home Office. So there are four broad areas of working in the Home Office. There's immigration enforcement, there's visas, there's the Passport Office, and there's, what's the one that I'm forgetting? Border Force. Within each of those areas, there is policy, there is strategy, and there's operations, and then there's just general analysis. So if you come in as an operational researcher, say into my current role, and I decided, and my current role is a strategic role, in fact, if I decided that either strategy didn't work for me, I could organise a managed move so that I could move to either an operational or a policy role. If I decided operational research didn't work for me, I think that one's a bit trickier. I could go and try other roles within operational research to see whether I just didn't like that role, or to see whether I just really don't like operational research. And if it's the latter, then my opportunities are to either reapply for a different analytical service, so stats, economics, or social research. So there are government, basically government groups that deal with all of those areas of analysis. Or I could try and get promoted, which you probably don't want to do if you don't like operational research, because you need the skills for promotion. But the sort of higher up you go in government, the less analysis you do, the more leadership you do. You could just move sideways into a completely non-analytical role, to be honest. So the flexibility is really there. And the whole point of the civil service is that once we put the effort into recruiting you, we don't really want to lose you, because every day you're gaining experience, skills, and knowledge. And frankly, we don't ever want to lose that expertise if we can avoid it. So I think it's as flexible as you want it to be, within reason, of course, but yeah.
first.
Oh, sorry.
My question's for Bruce. Your background's quite technical and based in instrumentation, partly, and most of the jobs that I seem to come up for organisations like yours, engineering organisations, seem to want or ask for people who've worked on instrumentation projects. Do you think there's a place in Airbus and similar organisations for people who've just done analytic work or data analysis and mathematics?
There is. There are various different departments, and there will be areas which will much prefer that kind of work, that kind of background. Particularly, there's the cyber departments for computing security and stuff like that. Where I am specifically is more hardware-based, although even that is very theoretical in nature, because we are effectively designing work to be used. Having said that, I think that it's difficult to get into that area if you don't have any technical background from your PhD. But a clear understanding of the applications of the technologies, I think, is also a valuable thing. So it is difficult. In that case, it would probably depend on who applied and what other skills you can bring. So I'd like to say, in summary, there are positions, but probably not quite so much in the engineering roles. Places more like the Airbus site in Newport and other places like that, which do the computing side of things, is probably more appropriate.
Okay, I think there was someone over there.
I think this is for Nicky. Because you were talking about OR and especially OR, and so it is kind of the technical side of joining the civil service. But I was wondering, so I guess we have let's say a set of analytical skills, but for example, I mean, I don't know about the others, but some of us may not have extensive knowledge of statistics, for example, and that seems to be the side that the technical side that's most needed for obvious reasons, because you deal with populations and whatever. And I was wondering how crucial that is. How would they look? The absence of dealing with that directly, and kind of the absence of perhaps even background, because at the end of the day we're physicists, and whilst there is statistics in what I do, it's not the core, I would say.
Sure. So several elements to my answer. The first is that when you apply for an operational research role, we don't test you on statistics. We test you on your problem structuring skills. We do test you on your general analytical skills, but we don't specifically ask you to talk about hypothesis testing or anything that is really statistical. Second of all, operational research you don't normally get roles which end up looking at statistics of things. In fact, we have a whole other area of analysis in government called statistics, so it's usually statisticians who work there. In operational research, a lot of what we do is we build models, and whether they are mathematical models or just sort of more theoretical models, that's a larger part of what we do. In a way, we are a bit of a management science, because although we have those complex analytical skills, we have the programming skills, we also need those skills to go to our stakeholders, to go to meetings and identify what people's needs are and how we can best answer those needs with analysis, but in a way that will actually help to inform their decision, rather than being, well, here's a really pretty chart, it doesn't really help you in any other way, but, you know, it's cool, isn't it? So, yeah, I think that's a bit more important, really, than your knowledge of statistics. And frankly, if you do end up, say, in your first or second role in government, in a more statistical role, we put money towards your training and development, so we would send you on a stats course.
Okay, I've got one question I'm going to ask as chair, actually, which is about both your occupations. One of the things we're often interested in, often complain about academia, is the absence of, say, flexibility in working life, and people, complain about how difficult it is to juggle relationships and families and so on. How do you find your respective industries in that?
Things are less flexible than they are in academia. And I think for me, that's partly because what we have in Evas is sort of core times when you have to be on site, unless you're in meetings or something like this. And in those core times, you're expected to be there. And that seems a little odd to an academic who works with lots of people across the world. But what it is these are big sites, and often many of the people that you want to talk to are down the corridor or somewhere else on the site. So everyone is on site, and you know they'll be there, and it makes working much more efficient. And for that reason, it makes sense. But those core times, for instance, I go home at 4 o'clock. So it's not exactly strenuous. You just have to be there at certain periods. Plus, you get Friday afternoons off, which is quite nice, providing you do all your hours and you work your normal time. So there is flexibility, but it's still different to academia.
So I find that really interesting. We also have core hours in the civil service. They're usually about 10 till 11:30 and then 2 till 4-ish, where you're expected to be working. But I would actually think of it as more flexible than when I was doing my PhD because, well, first of all, doing my PhD, I was working with people from around the world, so I frequently woke up at 2 in the morning because I had an email that was marked urgent, and I worked on weekends, and I felt that because I was sort of running my own career through my PhD, that I needed to be 24/7 on it. Government is very pro-flexible working. We have laptops, we have Blackberries. So for example, on a normal week, I go into my normal office twice a week. I work from home another day, and then I either go into a different office or sort of make up where I go on the fly. So we have those options for flexible working, and I think in terms of home work balance, it's absolutely fantastic. Obviously, living in London, the commute is probably the worst aspect of that, but it's very important to the civil service that you have that home life, and they have a lot of options for people, say if you've just had a child, if you only want to work part-time, if you want to work really odd hours, like take 1 day off every 2 weeks, you can do that, which I really love, and a lot of people really like the civil service for that reason.
Great.
Actually, one thing to follow up on that, moving into industry and having what I think of as being, very regular hours, it's nice to have my evenings back, as opposed to working into the evening. And friends of mine who are still in academia, especially lecturers, are working on Sundays in the evenings, doing lectures, preparation. It's arguably lighter workload at some level.
Definitely.
That's very interesting to hear, and a very positive note to end on. I think we should, before we thank the speakers, so you've got lunch now. You need to be back here or in the other room for, I think, 2:10. I don't have the program in front of me. And 20 to 2, I think it is, Vishanti is running her workshop on practical applications and so on, careers and CVs. So please do attend that if you think that would be useful. But other than that, I think we should thank Bruce and Nicky for a couple of fascinating talks.